data. So if you looked at percentage growth year over year, the number one state for percentage growth was Oklahoma. It was very high. It was 77%. And we in our report really admit that we know that a lot of that was due to virtuals. If you look at the number two state in terms of percentage of charter school enrollment growth, that was Alabama, which, Katrina Murkison is from Alabama, and she can tell you her kid is not in a virtual charter. She didn't move him to put him into a virtual charter. If you look at raw numbers, which is a different slice on the data, the highest raw number data also was Oklahoma. That was 35,000 new students enrolled in charter schools. But if you look at the number two highest state, that was Texas, and it was not attributed to that. So it would be convenient to say that this was all due to virtual charter schools, but the data simply do not bear that out. Also, it might be convenient to say that this was a fluke. The seat time data that we're seeing right now for this school year, and we're just getting these numbers in, it's showing that we are in fact holding steady and growing. So parents have found something that works for them, and they're not interested in going back to the way it used to be.
So there were two kind of significant things in the news in the past week. One was the announcement by Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, that he is going to be spending, or his philanthropy is going to be spending $750 million to grow charter school seats over the next 5 years. There was also a pretty significant report in the New York Times on December 8th about the frustration and the anger level of parents. I think they used the word furious in the headline, over continued closings of classrooms, not just because of quarantining, but also because of teacher burnout and the need to give mental health days. How do you think that is going to affect the trends that you already defined in this report going forward?
So the first thing, let's start with the Bloomberg announcement. This is significant. It's significant in terms of the dollar amount, but also in terms of the timing. So if we look at what the federal government has done to support charter schools, they've really held flat with their funding. And this has been true for the past 5 years. And this is specifically funding that is to go for the startup and replication of charter schools. Now, Mr. Bloomberg is coming in at $750 million, as you said. That is a very significant bump. Federal government funding per year for the charter schools program is at $440 million. So you see that's almost like 2 years of charter schools program funding. Significant because 60% of charter schools are single site schools. They're run by individuals who are former educators who believe that they have a different way to be able to reach children in their communities. And these dollars will help us to support more of these hyper-local, community-based schools by educators who are in those communities, know these kids, love these families, and want an opportunity to create a really special learning environment for them. So I think this is, I can't overstate what a tremendous boost this is going to be to the charter sector. And the other point that you raised about the continual closing, that's a thing. It is a really big thing. And even there were a lot of parents who had been very satisfied with their children's schools up until the time of the pandemic. They were close to their kids in a way that they hadn't been during the school day before. And so people were finding that their kids were getting maybe like 30 minutes of instructional time a week, which is just nuts. And they were also able to more closely look at the types of assignments that were coming home. And so the teacher burnout thing is real. The flexibility and nimbleness of the charter sector allowed these schools to be reactive in real time to what parent demand was. So they literally could poll their parents monthly, weekly, and say, are you ready for your children to come back into classrooms, or do you prefer to have them home? And let me be clear, this changed from community to community. There were some communities that were particularly hard hit by the pandemic that were not ready to come back into school. And so charters were able to listen to that and to be responsive. And then there were others who were ready to, and charters were able to be responsive to that. I think parents want that kind of responsiveness.
I think you're exactly right. And so to my last question, I can't resist. What do policymakers need to do right now with regards to parents? How can they spread around what's happening in the charter sector with this responsiveness to more parents and more families?
I'd say two things. One, you better listen. Better listen to what parents are telling you because, did we just see the elections that happened in this fall? People who are out of step on charter schools and are running for elected office are going to be out of office. That is number one. The second thing that I think is important for policymakers to know is that parents are holding us all accountable. They are demanding more for their kids. We need more, not fewer public school options. We need to equip all public schools to be able to have the type of nimbleness and flexibility that we see in the charter sector. Rather than infighting in public education, we would do well to listen to parents and to do what they are telling you they want us to do.
And that is a perfect segue to my two parents. I'm very anxious to get to my policymaker panelists, and I appreciate your indulgence with being patient for a minute, but I really do want to hear from Katrina and Matt. Katrina, how did you learn about I3 Academy, which is where you switched your son Ethan to? And did Debbie get it right about parents like yourself?
Well, we learned about, and it's Evan, by the way.
I apologize.
Okay. But we learned about I3 Academy through a great friend of mine who actually is a teacher at I3 Academy. He reached out to me, and this was in July of 2020, so right in the middle of the pandemic. And he was, wondering what we were going to do when it was time to go back to school. So this is July. School was slated to start the first week of August, and there were no answers coming from the district, none at all. So we were unsure as to what it was we were going to do. So he told me that there were actually some fifth grade slots still available. And he said to me, this is where my boy needs to be. He said, this is where he needs to be because he knows how my son learns. He's an out of the box type thinker, and just, sitting in front of a worksheet doesn't work for him. So I said, okay, we'll think about it. I talked to my son about it. I said, what do you think about, changing schools this year? And he was like, I don't know. I'll miss my friends, but I don't mind a new change. And so with that, I filled out the application, heard back. We were number one on the waiting list. And then a couple of days later, we got the offer of acceptance. So we hit the ground running, did all the paperwork we needed to do, withdrew him from his school. And we are ever so happy that we made that decision. It was the absolute best decision that I made for my son. So yes, Debbie got it right. Debbie absolutely got it right. I think in the pandemic, parents were scrambling around because nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody knew what was going to be done. But I3 Academy had a plan in place already. They had a plan in place. They were in contact. The community partnerships are amazing because they're always in contact with the doctors at UAB and the nurses, letting them know, what do we need to do? Do we need to close? Do we need to do? They opened a school in the middle of a pandemic. And that still blows my mind. And they stayed open the entire school year. And that still blows my mind. And so that's why we made a change, because they had a plan in place. And it's a better opportunity for my son to learn, to have a new way of learning, and to, just to grow and thrive. And I've seen him grow and thrive. He's a sixth grader now at the middle school, and he is just off the chain.
Well, I'm very happy for Evan, and we're going to hear from you again a little later. Matt, why is a public charter school the right choice for 4 of your 5 kids?
It'd be 5 of 5 if the oldest one wasn't 2. So, the youngest one, excuse me. So years ago, I heard Mark Wilson, who's the Florida Chamber of Commerce president, speak. And he was talking about generational poverty. He said one of the ways we break the generational poverty cycle is with school choice. He had 3 kids, and he said they all learn differently, so they all go to different schools. And with 5 kids, that resonated with me, that I had 5 different individuals. They all learn differently. And the fact that I could send them to different types of schools was attractive to me. Living in Florida, I think we can thank organizations like the Florida Chamber and leaders like our Education Commissioner, Richard Corcoran. If you haven't read up on Richard, he's amazing. Congressman Byron Donalds, who you all may recognize from Fox News. He's on there quite regularly, and he's an advocate for school choice in the state of Florida. Representative Stan McClain, and then most importantly, Senator Manny Diaz, who I believe is a common denominator for all of our curriculum advancements and school choice options in Florida. For me, with 5 kids, I have had them in private, traditional, public, and classical charter school. And I made the choice to switch to charter because we were in a parent-teacher conference with one of my son's teachers. I was asking her about one of the computer assessments that she did with him, asked scoring grades and how they figured out this. She suggested that I Google it. And then I knew then that I was probably in the wrong place, at least for me, because I didn't feel like me Googling it I thought that was her job to explain it to me. That coupled with the fact that the curriculum wasn't shared with us regularly, no books came home, and I felt that the kids were getting an average education at what was referred to as the best elementary school in the county. Did it for us as soon as we found out that we had an opportunity to send the kids to a classical charter school, Tallahassee Classical School in Tallahassee, Florida. And we enrolled my kids there. They're enrolled now. We're in year 2. We also opened in the midst of a pandemic. I believe in the charter school movement. I serve on the board there, and I look forward to helping like all the kids in the United States of America get an excellent education, because I think if we continue down the average education path, we're going to get average results and average outcomes, and we're not an average country. We're a great country, and we need to return to that. So that's why I feel the way I do.
Thanks, Matt. So now that we've heard about the urgency that many parents are feeling around their children's education in this difficult time, I want to turn to Senator Dave Ciccola, who helped author the charter school bill in Delaware in 1995. And Senator, you served as chair of the Education Committee for many, many years, and just 3 years ago came off of that position, but you're still on the committee. What is the level of support amongst lawmakers in your state for charter schools? And Matt just mentioned a whole bunch of elected officials in Florida, and we know a lot of those are Republicans. So I'm curious to hear what's going on with Democrats specifically as well in Delaware.
Yeah, so we were probably at a low point 5 years ago with respect to support for charters. And our legislature has gotten younger and more diverse. And I think that's more important than the fact that it's also gotten a little more democratic, because I think we have a mix that is a really good mix of people who do listen to parents. Some of them are parents. And there are other stories like my wife's brother's family, who had one kid who went to a charter high school, one kid who went to a vocational high school, and one kid who went to a traditional high school. And that was the right choice for each of them. I know them well enough to know that they really wrestled with those decisions. But in each case, I think they made the right choice, and the history, I think, is gonna prove it.
A longtime federal senator from Delaware now sits in the White House and is part of leading an administration that is arguably amongst the least friendly to charter schools in decades. Charter schools have always been bipartisan. They've enjoyed support on either side of the aisle at the top of party going back to Bill Clinton. At PPI, we worry about a vacuum of leadership on the Democratic side in this area, as allowing outcomes like we saw in Virginia last month in the governor's race. We also worry about this vacuum of leadership allowing public education to be a battleground in the culture wars. What can we do as a party or as just responsible citizens to depoliticize this and ensure that parents are being heard and are having choices for how their children are educated?
Well, I will tell you first, the good news is there is another long-term senator from Delaware who in 1995 was the governor of Delaware. And I work with him on the charter school law. And he continues to be a strong supporter. And I know he has the ear of the president. I do feel much more confident, though I recognize the fear and the concern some people have. I'm cautiously optimistic that we aren't worse off now. I think, in fact, in many ways, we are better off. But I do believe that the concerns you raised are valid, and I think the main thing we have to do is we have to keep listening, and we have to keep talking. Debbie earlier said change is hard, and and it's amazing how many people are making a change during a pandemic at a time, because we do tend to fear things that are a little bit unknown. But as more and more people have jumped in on this and have had good experiences, we need the rest of public education, because in Delaware, charter schools are public schools, and we need the rest of public education to listen as well.
Thank you so much. And you're right. Not only in Delaware, but everywhere, charter schools are public schools. And that's a message that we need to keep hammering home. And in fact, when Debbie and I had a pre-call about this, and we talked about the disenrollment, the enormous numbers of disenrollment, I think it's around 3% in the traditional public schools. She mentioned that those who would oppose charter schools might be wanting to rethink and be thankful for charter schools for keeping about 250,000 kids in the public school system who might have otherwise gone away to homeschooling or some other option, and would no longer be part of the system that has made, been the backbone of American democracy for time out of mind. And so with that, I'm going to go from big politics down to small politics. And Jessica, you represent Ward 6 in Washington, D.C., which is not a high poverty ward. But you have about 50%, if I'm right, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's about 50-50 of your kids attending charter schools versus traditional schools. How do you straddle that fence and support both? And what are you hearing from parents?
Yeah, thank you for that. So in Washington, D.C., we do have roughly 50% of kids in public charter schools. And in Ward 6, I have an incredibly diverse set of folks I represent. I see it as my job to represent all the children who live in the ward, wherever they go to school, and all the children who go to school in the ward, wherever in the city they live. Because in D.C., children cross wards every day to go to school, whether they're crossing to go to a traditional public school or to a public charter school, they're constantly moving around the city. So I have 20 traditional public schools and 16 public charter schools in my district. And those kids range too in very diverse ways. We have roughly 14% of those students within Ward 6 who are students with disabilities. And depending on which neighborhood within the ward, anywhere from 20% to 60% of students who are considered students at risk. It's a funding determination we use to talk about students who are on SNAP or public assistance, or who are homeless or who are over age for their grade. So hugely diverse list. What we're seeing from parents is that parents made a lot of different choices during the pandemic. We saw a slight drop in enrollment in the traditional public schools in DC, which was accompanied by an increase of about 950 students enrolling in public charter schools across the city. And we had about a 300 student increase in our homeschooling, which is notable because our homeschooling doubled from the year before the pandemic to the time during the pandemic. And now the year that all of DC's students this year went back to school in person, we had very limited virtual options. So the fact that that change still happens suggests that parents are looking for schools that are responsive to them. I think we're pretty lucky in DC that we have innovation, both in our traditional public sector and our charter sector. But watching parents move, they're moving to places where they feel like the school heard them and reached out to say, what kind of measures do we need to have in place to make you feel safe about sending your children back to the building? What kind of communication is going to be helpful this year post-pandemic, knowing how difficult last year was for you and your students? And we saw really wonderful things from some of our public charter schools in making that happen. We saw Friendship public charter schools reaching out to parents and saying, we're going to do on-site testing for 100% of students and faculty every day. And they did that before that was the common practice citywide. We had charters taking the lead on discussions about vaccination, about making vaccination clinics available on their school sites. We also had charters taking the lead on saying, we're going to continue this one-to-one device work so that if your child has to be home for any reason, the learning doesn't stop, it can continue. And so we've really seen that kind of work take place.
You mentioned that you are fortunate in DC because you have both charter schools and traditional schools that are innovating. Do you think that those innovations are feeding off of each other? And this is a good setup for my next question for AJ as well. Do you see the innovation schools kind of pulling the traditional schools along? Do you see the traditional schools contributing thought leadership to any charter schools? Because that really is one of the original ideas for charter schools. It wasn't just to create competition for competition's sake, but it was to lift all boats, right? That the charter schools would bring district schools along where appropriate. And are you seeing that?
Absolutely. We have one school in Ward 6 that's part of our traditional system called Van Ness Elementary. They're the Otters. It's maybe my favorite mascot in the city. And they're a traditional neighborhood school, and they work with an organization called Transcend Education to really build sort of an innovative program within the school. And when you watch things happening at Van Ness, you see other public schools sort of looking in, coming to tour the school, see they have maker spaces in every classroom, and you watch teachers from other schools around the city come and visit that. That kind of thing is very common in what we're seeing in some of the expeditionary learning charter schools we have in the district, or the Montessori charter schools we have in the district. And I do think there's a lot of feeding off. I think parents are part of the driving force of that. When you have so many choices and you have strong parent advocates reaching out to say, you know, I have a child in this other school and I'm seeing these positive things happening there. Is it possible for us to do this work here? We're going to start to see more of that change because our families are asking for it on behalf of their students. I just want to give a shout out to a group we have here in town. We have a group of parents called PAVE, Parents Amplifying Voices in Education. And they work with parents who have kids in all sectors of education, public, charter, private. And they work to help them really identify what is most needed in public education, then to make sure that those parents have direct access to policymakers, and to help those parents make sure their voices are amplified in all the ways possible. Testifying before our DC Council or the State Board of Ed, writing op-eds to make sure that's heard on behalf of the issues parents find most important. So I think all of that works together with our public and public charter schools to make the educational choices families have that much stronger.
So we have about 100 people watching this webinar right now. If there are parents or educators out there who would like to see an organization seated like a PAVE in a community that doesn't have one, is there a resource where they might be able to contact someone to sort of look at what they're doing and how they would go about recreating that somewhere else?
That's a great question. I'm certainly happy to make connections for folks to PAVE. So happy to do that. I know there are lots of organizations around the country like PAVE in cities that are working to do this parent amplification. There's a group called the National Parents Union that is also working with all these organizations. So they're probably the best resource for what is happening in your community or how you might be the force to start something like that in your community using those resources. So I would definitely encourage folks to look out the National Parents Union.
Yes, and we have had its leader, Carrie Rodriguez, on our webinars more than once, and she's quite dynamic, and they are a very dynamic organization. So as Jessica said, if you're watching today and you are interested in starting your own group or joining a group that might exist, I would reach out to the National Parents Union. And on that note, I want to go to AJ because the specific reason that I asked him to be here is twofold. He is the Deputy Commissioner for Governance at the Texas Education Agency, which is the name for the State Department of Education in Texas, but he's also the Director of Governance at the Council of the Great City Schools. And for those who may not know, that is an umbrella organization that advocates and supports for the nation's 100 largest school districts, or the largest school district in a state if it's not one of the 100 largest. And they do really great work. And I'm wondering, Deputy Commissioner Crable, from your point of view, if you are seeing at the Council for the Great City Schools any of these traditional districts trying to innovate to either keep up with charters in their district or in response to parents' needs during the pandemic that we've been going through.
So I do have two full-time jobs. Shifted a little bit. And so certainly leading governance work nationwide with the council, as well as my role in Texas has shifted in that I'm actually been assigned as the receiver for a district on the south side of Dallas that's been struggling. And so I'm here now and had to step out of a meeting with my principals to spend time with you all today. From both of those perspectives, from working with the state agency here in Texas, leading a small urban district on the south side of Dallas, and from working with school districts around the country, many of whom are engaged in partnerships with charters, with universities, and a variety of configurations to try to innovate. The short answer is no. What I haven't observed is significant innovation around how do we improve student outcomes at the systemic level. Most of the innovation that I've seen over the past 9 months has been how do we educate in the middle of a pandemic, which I would not consider those to be the same thing. I mention that because my sense is the only way that traditional public schools see a significant resurgence in enrollment is through improving the quality of instruction. I don't think there are gimmicks that work. I think either we have schools that dramatically demonstrate improvements in student outcomes, or we don't. And whether they be charter schools or traditional district schools, the ones that can demonstrate improvements, I hope will grow and that we'll have courageous leaders who help them grow, and the ones that can't, I hope will go away, and similarly hope we have courageous leaders that help them go away. Certainly in my time as deputy commissioner, one of my duties when I joined the agency was being the statewide authorizer. And I am very proud of the fact that during my time with the agency, for the very first time, the set of all charter schools statewide slightly narrowly outperformed the set of all district schools for the first time. This is based on research done by research out of Stanford. And when I called them and asked them to come and visit with my staff to share, how did this happen? How did we get to this point where for the very first time, I think this was in 2018, did the charter portfolio outperform the district portfolio? They said unequivocally, the number one thing that happened in Texas is that you came along as deputy commissioner and started closing as many horrible charter schools as you possibly could, as quickly as you possibly could. And that as a result, the quality of the portfolio as a whole rose. I think that remains instructive as we come to hopefully the far side of the pandemic, that part of the quality, increase in quality we'll see will be from failures, both in the charter sector and the district sector, and leaders having the courage to pull the plug when children are not being well served. So if district schools want to benefit from that phenomenon, then the way to get there is to outperform by showing improvements in student outcomes.
That's right. And I'm really happy to hear you talk about closing low performing charters, because that's the accountability. You get the autonomy, but you need the accountability. And we see places like, for example, in Michigan, where low performing charters are just allowed to perpetuate. So that's really great. What needs to happen at the policy level to encourage these status quo districts, as I'm calling them, to either start closing low performing schools or to get on board with innovating in their systems, as you said, no gimmicks, to try to regain enrollment or to compete? We know that the federal government is sending a lot of money out to the states to distribute to school districts. What can policymakers do to encourage the kind of change that we need to see right now? Either with or without that. I mean, you can bring federal money into it or not. I was
about to say, unfortunately, I don't know the federal resources help. And I've had this conversation with my district leaders nationwide. Is that in far too many places, I feel like resources have been deployed in ways that have been designed to make adults whole, but not in ways designed to make children whole. And so we've seen what I consider absurd schemes to send one-time bonuses out to every single member of the district staff, which sounds noble and loving and wonderful in the middle of a pandemic when adults are suffering and where resources are tight and things are hard. I hear that. I'm entirely unmoved by it, and I find it repulsive. Those resources needed to be targeted specifically toward how do we improve outcomes for students, which largely boils down to how are we increasing the quality of instruction that students are experiencing, and how are we increasing the quantity of quality instruction that students are experiencing, and simply giving handouts to every member of staff without some type of system for identifying how are we targeting those funds toward our students who need it the most. Like, that to me is not descriptive of a system that's going to make a difference for children. Make a difference for adults, almost certainly, but make a difference for children, absolutely not. And so I don't predict that we'll see widespread performance improvements as a result of deployed resources. And I find that sad. That being said, at the same time that is my prognosis nationwide, I can point you absolutely to both charter and district school leaders who have taken those resources and said, we are going to target this in a way that's going to have the most good for the most number of students, recognizing that is not the same as deploying it in a way that will do the most good for the most number of adults. And my sense is that the researchers aren't going to miss a beat on this, that I already, as I visit with professors and researchers across the country, many are already looking at how do we dig into the data that the pandemic provides to learn from what can we do from a policy level for public education nationwide on a go-forward basis. What are the strategies that worked and what are the strategies that don't work? I suspect the schools that had more in-person instruction are going to show greater results, and that's going to be a clear policy description for future pandemics. I think of this as our starter pandemic. I have, unfortunately, every confidence that in our lifetimes we will experience another one. And so what I'm hopeful for is that as the research comes out, that it will dictate closing the schools and leaving them closed for a year had negligible impacts on the spread of the pandemic and significant impacts on the well-being of children, both educationally, which is my top concern, but also psychologically and socially, which can't be discounted. And so have I seen the type of innovation that the quantity of resources might have suggested? No, I've not. But are there examples in the darkness where people have really brought the light? Absolutely. And as that research is conducted in the coming couple of years, I think we all need to pay very close attention to it, because it's probably going to tell us stuff that many of us don't want to hear, but that we're going to need to know for the next time a situation like this comes along.
I think you're right. And you are joined in your belief that this is a starter pandemic by Robin Lake. She was tweeting about that this morning, and what do we need to do to get, to get prepared going forward. And of course, I'm sure she will be contributing greatly to the research. I want to come back to you on governance, but I want to give our parents a chance to weigh in just again. Matt, Florida is such a big school choice state. You've got the opportunity scholarships, the Hope scholarships, other voucher programs, as well as a ton of charter schools. Do you think that there is enough choice in Florida? And I would ask you to think about, especially for marginalized populations. You talked at the beginning about breaking the cycle of poverty. Even in Florida, which is one of the most prolific states, is it enough?
I would argue that it's never enough. I think as for success to continue to grow a movement, I think you have to continue to add more options. I would add to that, we've got a significant homeschooling population in Florida, which for my purposes and my wife's purposes, we're just not wired to teach our kids. But it's another choice that we have in Florida. So I believe that Florida is, I think ahead of a lot of states, and maybe a good benchmark for some other states, and a learning opportunity for some other states on how to grow in choice. And some of the people I mentioned earlier are some of the greatest minds, I think, in the school choice movement. I keep going back to Manny Diaz. He is an amazing human being, an amazing educator, and came from the education movement before getting into politics. So I think part of that is that's part of his success, and his intuition and the way he kind of does legislation. It usually makes sense from a parents and students perspective. So I'm saying a lot just to say, I think long answer short, it's never enough, but I think we're constantly evolving in Florida, and I like that about our state. And we have the environment, right, and the leaders and the folks, the voters to do it, and the school choice movement. But for, I think, some of our public school superintendents, but for those folks, everybody's kind of on board with the movement.
And Katrina, you are on the other side of the coin. You are in Alabama, which has fewer than 10 charter schools statewide. Are parents even aware of these schools? Do they know what charter schools are? What needs to happen in your mind to make the kind of choice that you had for Evan available to more moms like yourself?
I don't think that a lot of parents are aware. I think as coming out of 2020 and about to come out of 2021, I think more parents are being made aware now, just from the few schools that have actually opened. I think it's up to the parents that have students in charter schools to get the word out, work with the head of school and their team, and kind of get the word out about charter schools and what they're all about. And what we've actually done at I3 is they've actually given the opportunity we've had some state reps to come through and tour the school and actually talk to myself and several other parents about why we made the choice for charter schools. So I think that's where it starts. It starts with the parents that are already there, and working with their school leaders to get the word out. And I it's gonna happen. It's gonna take time here in Alabama, but I think that it will happen. And we just need to be ready to go when it does. We just need to hit the ground running with it.
You might have to call the National Parents Union and see if you have a group like what Jessica was talking about, or maybe in all of your spare time, you could start one.
I think there may be, I think there is a group. They're called PALS, I think, but I'll have to do a little more research on that to figure that out. But my goodness.
Senator Ciccola, I am going to give you the floor to react to any of this. I had a question for you about the federal money, but we kind of talked about that a little bit. You sitting on an education committee in your state Senate for so many years, what do you think needs to happen to create more accountability? And that can be accountability from traditional districts, accountability from parents. Give us your thoughts on that. Oh, I think you're muted, Senator. You are.
Sorry about that. So there was a lot of money set aside, and to the extent that, and AJ hit on it a little bit when he was talking about, being able to monitor the results. And I think I worked for 34 years at DuPont, retired 6 years ago, and data is important and facts matter. And we need to look at the data and look at the facts. But we also need to recognize that not all kids learn the same. And there are outlier examples of kids who actually flourished during the pandemic. Some of those kids had access to things like Khan Academy that they had never, approached before, and were able to do things self-paced, and they just happened to connect. And others did better because they weren't in a setting where they were being bullied. And, so we have a whole lot of outlier reasons why different things happened. And we need to recognize that, so far so much money goes by formula. And I think we need good educators and good teamwork within schools to decide, okay, how are we going to better focus the use of funds so that we get the best results, for the most kids.
Thanks for that. And Jessica, I was going to ask you about some of the innovations that you've seen in the charter schools in your ward, and you can still talk about that, but you have a little bit already. What I'd like to ask you is, there are quite a few empty school buildings in Washington, D.C., and there are charter schools with long waits. Would the mayor's administration be well served to let charter schools expand into some of those empty school buildings in response to parent demand at this time?
It's a great question. So we have far fewer vacant buildings than we used to that are designed as schools. We have lots of vacant buildings now. The office space vacancies is a big popular topic in DC at the moment, but we don't have as many vacant school buildings as we used to. I do think there's a real question about how we expand our school choices for families. Our authorizer last year decided not to have an application cycle for new charters this year, and to promise to open one next year, but to look at what is the need for charters. And I think the question I hope we look at is, what do we mean by need? Is it just about demand for seats? We have empty seats in schools all across the district. But I wonder, and when I say district, I mean District of Columbia. So we have empty seats all across DC. What we don't necessarily have is available seats with the kinds of programs that we know families are on the wait list for. So I think we need to look at what is the need in terms of what kind of programs are parents on wait lists for? Do we need more expeditionary learning schools? Do we need more language immersion schools in our east of the river wards? Do we need more arts programming schools? I think those are the kinds of things we need to go out and ask families and communities, in addition to looking at waitlist data. And then I think we need to get creative about where we put them. If we have schools that have available seats, but we don't have folks flocking to them, how do we make space in those buildings where there is physical space available with new programs coming in? And how do we make that possible for folks to access? I think the couple ways to do that is to think about, who do we trust to open our schools? We have some wonderful charter management organizations in DC, both national organizations that have taken root here, like KIPP DC, which is our second largest district in the city. But we also have a lot of single site charter schools. And while DC's gentrified a lot over the past 20 years, most of our public school students are still Black. And we have a need, I think, for more school leaders and more schools grown by leaders who look like the folks, look like our students themselves. So right now in DC, we have quite a few single site charter schools, just one site schools. And many of those, though not enough, I think, are led by leaders of color. Right now in the city, we have 20 Black-led single-site charter schools and 28 Black-led LEAs in general, so folks that operate multiple schools. I think there's really an opportunity, too, to say, who are our community members who want to start these new schools? Who are the relationships they already have with families in their community? And how do we make those school choices available for families with the kinds of organizations and leaders with whom they already have relationships? So
when you say we need to be doing this, who is the we? Is it the school board? Is it PAVE? I mean, somebody's got to take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and say, we're going to do this work. So who is that?
Great question. I think our authorizer needs to build this into their new process for opening new schools and the new application process. I think our parent advocates and our school advocates need to be out there speaking to the authorizer and rounding folks up and bringing them to the table to say, this is the need we have. I think our state board already hears from families every month at our public meetings. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of this, but I hope that we're cataloging all the things that we've heard from families about what they need in schools and what they want in schools, and that we show up to say, when you open this new application, we think we need these kinds of schools in these places serving kids at this grade level, and this is how we should make it all map out and happen. There's a lot of talk in DC about the need for more comprehensive or systematic planning around education, and I think it tends to make folks in the charter sector nervous because it feels like top-down planning. But I think we have to harness that back and take it for ourselves and say, all of us who care about schools should want systematic planning that takes into account the voices of parents who haven't found schools that are right for their children, and we need to make them part of the planning for our education system.
But Tressa, just a quick note on that point. When I was board chair in Kansas City, Missouri Public Schools, prior to my arrival, the district categorically refused to partner with charters in terms of building usage. One of the things that I led our board toward was a very different policy of performance contracts with charters. We'll gladly let you lease a building, but you have to actually perform. And as long as you're getting results for students, then we'll lease you more space. And the moment that you're not getting results for students, we will kick you to the curb and make those seats available for providers who can actually get the job done for children.
Hey, I'm so glad that you jumped in on that, AJ. Just one second, Matt, were you going to make a comment? Go ahead, I'll come back.
Yeah, no, I was just going to tell him if he wanted to move to Florida and run for superintendent of schools in our county, we'll welcome him.
He did an amazing job in Kansas. You should look it up. Kansas was a hot mess until AJ got there, and he put his heart and soul into really improving that district. But what I wanted to say is, I'm so glad you brought that up, AJ, because you just approached a topic that's very near and dear to our hearts at Reinventing America's Schools. Indianapolis is doing just what you mentioned. They're calling them the innovation schools. And I was going to jump in on this anyways, because of what Jessica said about needing to harness that information about what kinds of schools are in demand. And in Indianapolis, they have an incubator called the Mind Trust. And it's a nonprofit organization that incubates these schools that inhabit district buildings. And what they do to do that is they provide a planning year. So if you're going to be a school leader who's approved to run a school in a district building, you get a year where you're funded, that you're not pressured to bring an enrollment, you get to plan. And a lot of that planning is spent going out into the community. And in fact, many times these leaders have come in with an idea that they're going to do a college prep, or they're going to do a STEM, or they're going to do a particular kind of school, only to find out that that is not at all what the community is looking for. So we did an actual report on that at Reinventing America's Schools. It's called the Innovation Schools Guide. It is front and center on our webpage. You can download a PDF, and it also includes at the end some model legislation. So Matt, if you think your state needs another form of school choice, and there might be somebody out there who wants to introduce legislation to allow districts to create innovation school, it's right there at your fingertips on the website. We have about 7 minutes left, and I am going to go back to Debbie Vinny for a moment. She's the one that did all the work on this great report, and she has been shut out of the conversation for quite a bit of time. Debbie, I'm just going to open the floor to you and let you weigh in on what you've heard and what you think maybe needs a little bit more amplification in the context of your report.
Thank you so much, Tressa, and thanks for having me here today. This has been a great discussion with a great group of panelists. I think what's really important to drive home with the report is that it just wasn't a fluke, and we are continuing to see indications that it's going to continue growing. And I'm going to also double down on the point that she made before. Charter schools were the only part of the public education sector that grew during the pandemic year. And that is a true movement, because it was people in all different kinds of places who were motivated by a number of different reasons, but made the same move. And we talk a lot of times in the charter school space about it being a movement, but this really is a parent movement. And we are proud that we were able to attract 240,000 new students into charter schools during the pandemic year. We believe that public education is a public trust. And we think an important part of that trust is being responsive to the communities that we're privileged to serve. And we're we're not being true to our responsibility if we're not being responsive and listening to parents. And we would all do well to engage them as the partners that they are. I think it's a fantastic moment. I've not seen parent engagement like this ever. And I know that it's not going to go back. People have gotten a taste of what freedom looks like. They figured out that they actually have a lot more options than many of them realized. And while frustration might have led them to charter schools, that's not what's keeping them there. What's keeping them there is that it is an excellent educational opportunity for their children. And I encourage charter operators and school leaders to take that responsibility seriously and to continue to be a really awesome educational experience for these parents and for these students who are entrusting themselves to us.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's probably fair to say that the theme coming out of this, my big takeaway is parent responsiveness. We need at all levels, school boards, lawmakers, policymakers, teachers, principals, up and down the chain. And I think when you talk about parents experiencing freedom, you're not going to put that back in the toothpaste. But you also talked about the public trust. And I want to go back to AJ for just a minute, Deputy Commissioner AJ, because you, as well as all the other hats that you wear, you train school boards. And I think when we're talking about school board governance, the ultimate public trust lies with those board members who are tasked with ensuring that schools are delivering. How do we get better school boards, and how do we hold school boards more accountable?
I think there are two different types of sins that I see: the charter school board sins and district school board sins. Both of them, have the same root cause, a focus on adult outcomes and adult well-being above student outcomes and student well-being. On the charter side, the most consistent sin I see is people who are more committed to the success of the founder than they are to the outcomes of the students. This must die. This is absolutely a persistent phenomenon that I see in charter schools across the country. And it is just as responsible for the destruction of what's possible for children as the politically driven behaviors that I see in district schools, where there's disproportionate pressure on district leaders, school board leaders, to pay attention to the wants and needs of adult constituencies at the expense of improving student outcomes. How do you address these things? All of my beliefs on this come back to a core idea that student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change, and that we have to reimagine how we train school board leaders so that is a rallying cry, that it's not waiting for us to have the right students, not waiting to have the non-poor students, not waiting until we have all of poverty solved or all of other circumstances solved. Recognizing that what's possible for children emerges from my ability and my willingness to change my adult behavior in the boardroom. And as I do so, I create a culture that acknowledges that we are 100% responsible for improving student outcomes, and that collectively as adults, we're called to be more powerful in whatever circumstances our children face. As school board members, embrace that as a core belief, and then build systems of performance management around that. We're actually monitoring student progress on a monthly basis in the board meetings. That those behaviors combined, I've observed, have made a meaningful difference both in the charter world and district world in terms of the quality of board member behavior. Part of what we need to do is we just need to start training them sooner. And so my recommendation to school districts is the same thing to charters. Identify and train everyone who's going to serve on the school board at least 3 to 6 months before they are seated in these basic principles about performance management and about the influence, the primacy of adult behavior change as access to improvements in student outcomes.
Thanks, AJ. And Senator, we're out of time, but I want you to quickly tell us the story of a change that you told me about that you saw on your education committee in the Senate. You're muted.
Sorry, I don't remember. I talked to you about a few things when we were.
You told me about the Senate education chair who has.
Yeah, she's a former teacher, and she's actually come around very nicely. It was my idea to put her in as chair because I thought that she needed to see the broad perspective that a chair sees. You're a commissioner to the Education Commission of the States. You're in Delaware. You're a member of the Southern Region Education Board Legislative Advisory Committee, and there's a few other things. And I think she's just done a phenomenal job, and will continue to improve.
Because she was originally quite opposed to charter schools.
Yep. Mhm.
And now she is having an open mind, you said, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I thought that was a hopeful note for us to end on. And I had intended to give Matt and Katrina the last word, but we are over time. So my apologies to you, but you both were a tremendous addition to this webinar. And I thank you so much for your time. Thanks to all of my panelists, AJ for stepping out of a meeting. Jessica, I know you're busy with your ward. And Debbie, you're probably working on some other fabulous research project as we speak. So thanks to everybody. And thanks to the audience. Everybody stayed with us for the full hour. That's fabulous. And happy holidays to you all.